Admin, please open the. Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon or evening to you all. For those who have been in SCoT, welcome back again. And for the new friends and colleagues, welcome to SCoT Smart Community Tourism Webinar Series. Today we are with you with a very important topic, localizing tourism and discussion on centering local communities in tourism features. We are with you with 90 minutes or slightly more presentations and panel discussions as is the norm in SCoT. Without any ado, in the beginning, I would like to ask the president of SCoT, Professor Jafari, to invite us with the opening remark. Professor Jafari, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Kazem. Good morning to all of you. It's good evening here for us. For those of you who are repeaters, you already know SCoT, but those of you who are not, it's the first time for you to join us. SCoT is a virtual event center. In other words, we have different events in the name of webinars, different topics, and often different languages, in different languages. And we have done about 72 or 3 webinars already, each time on a different topic. But our focus is basically on small communities, host communities. And we selected the word smart community tourism, somehow with not exactly sure whether we wanted to call it the smart, because the smart has a certain meaning in tourism literature. When we say smart destinations, often it means the destination is thinking of the tourist, what the tourist wants, and help the tourist out. And this is not what we are. Smart for us means wise community tourism development. And when it is wise, in my dictionary, wise means that the host is in the center. The host destination is in the center. And this is not the case in most cases of tourism industry in developed and developing countries. So basically, host is the forgotten population in tourism studies. Thanks to Berlin Smith in 1975, I'm not sure about the exact date, she published the first book on host and guest, anthropology of tourism. And that is when the word host and guest were popularized in the tourism literature. The guest received all the attention in the name of tourist, and the host got limited attention. As of today, based on my overall reading of what is published on the subject of tourism, some 90% are tourist-oriented, and maybe 10% about host community and their needs. So I'm very pleased that we have a very host-sensitive discussion today, putting the host in the center of discussion, empowering the host. And this is something that doesn't happen in many destinations because those, those who are in the tourism industry are themselves outsiders, and therefore they don't think about host community. So I hope in this, I'm pretty sure in this webinar, we are going to find and learn new ways of engaging the host in tourism. And when we do that, then we have been a wise community or wise destination because the color and the flavor and aroma and everything of the local tourism comes from local people. Tourism doesn't have its own flavor. The flavor comes from the host population. Sorry. So I'm looking forward to the presentation we have today, a very dynamic discussion. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, Jafar, very much for the information and key points about the SCoT. Today's moderator is Dr. Freya, and she has beautifully collected the panelists and managed the panel for us. She's an adjunct associate professor with Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies, University of Waterloo, visiting professor, Center for Research and Innovation in Tourism, Taylor's University of Malaysia, and adjunct with the Business Unit, University of South Australia. She has worked with industry, community, and non-profit organizations on projects that have worked at cutting edge of just and sustainable tourism. Dr. Freya is much well known than be introduced here more. And without any ado, I would like to ask her to start the panel. Dr. Freya, we are all yours.
Thank you so much, Kazem, and thank you, Jafar, for the introduction. It's lovely to join you in the SCoT webinars, and we really appreciate you hosting this opportunity for us to present some of the chapters in the book, The Local Turn in Tourism, Empowering Communities. My name is Freya, and I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of the custodians of the country on which I'm talking to you from, and the care for country that they've had. I'm speaking to you from Adelaide in South Australia, which is Kaurna country. The Kaurna people have cared for this place for millennia. And in fact, I'm on a part of a peninsula where a dreaming story happened, and this place was known for hunting emu. So the reason that this is very important is to acknowledge First Nations' place in this country, to acknowledge the fact that the land's never been ceded, and also to acknowledge ongoing care for country. For us, in thinking about the book, The Local Turn in Tourism, what it does is it concentrates our minds on the connections between people and place and love of place, and then how that love for place can be shared with others. And it can be an important force for better futures for us. So I'll start that way. I will also acknowledge the lovely people in the room. And in fact, one of our openings to the book, Vesper, is here with us. So it's lovely to have contributors to the book and friends of the book here. We have a panel today to present to you from authors of the book. We've got 4 sections to the book, which is divided in theories, and then secondly, case studies, and then thirdly, practitioners in this space, and then finally, forward-looking futures. And what I would hope to do is to introduce the panel to you and give them time to present. I'll do the presentations all in one go, give them time to present their thinking from their work, and then we can move to questions that come up with the lovely Professor Jim supporting us through the question period. I will give you an insight into our speakers' backgrounds, but I'm not going to read you their whole biographies. Extremely impressive and a bit too much for me to say in this space. So I do encourage you to go to the SCoT website and look at their biographies. Impressive individuals. And I just note that we have one speaker who is running late, and I'm not sure if she's going to make it. So we're going to be flexible. And that's my co-editor of the book, Bobby Chu Bigby. who we hope will be able to connect with us and join with us. The way that the panel will run is we will start with the lovely Antonia, then to Phoebe, and hopefully to Bobby if she can join us, and then fourthly, if Bobby's with us, to Professor Kang Sen. In introducing the panel, Dr. Antonia Canosa is impressing the tourism field with her research with and for young people. She's a research fellow with the Center for Children and Young People at Southern Cross University here in Australia. Her work focuses on children's rights, well-being, and safety in the tourism industry, and her work is grounded in social justice and critical pedagogy. Dr. Phoebe Everingham has a PhD in human geography from the University of Newcastle. She is currently a lecturer in environment and society with the Department of Geography and Planning at Macquarie Uni, and she is also an associate lecturer in the Faculty of Hospitality and Tourism Management, Sarawak campus, USCI, Malaysia. For Bobby, I think I'll leave her biography in case she doesn't make it, and if she makes it, then I will do her biography before she presents. And then finally, we have Professor Kensing Oy, who is, and I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name, that's payback for me having such a terrible name, is Professor of Cultural and Heritage Tourism at the School of Social Sciences, University of Tasmania. His research focuses on community and tourism issues, addressing matters such as the moral limits of the tourism market, the distribution of benefits and cost in tourism, and touristification. So we'll proceed with the panel one by one. As you listen to our speakers, if you have questions, please pop them in our chat and we will collect them. And we will try to have a great lively discussion between our speakers with their different points of view from their chapters. If we cannot address your question, please don't be frustrated because we do have limited time. What I will hope to do, if your question is vital to be answered, put a star on it, and we'll get back to you after the session with responses to your important questions. I'm really glad you're here. So without further ado, I'd love to hand over to Dr. Antonia for her presentation. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Freya. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I'll just share my slides with you. So I'm talking to you from the beautiful Byron Bay on the east coast of Australia. It's Saturday morning here, so I'm at home. And I just like to acknowledge and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging of the Araku people of the Bundjalung Nation on whose land I live and work in Byron Bay. As Freya mentioned, I have a passion for researching with children and young people. I do a lot of research on their human rights, their participation and well-being in the context of tourism. And I was really honoured to be invited to contribute to this progressive and fascinating edited collection that I have here with me. Probably can't see it. So today I'd just like to talk to you about the chapter that I put together. And funnily enough, today, 12th of August, is actually International Youth Day. So it's a good segue in my presentation. So this is the area where I live. Byron Bay is a popular tourist destination, both with domestic and international tourists. It's a hotspot for surfers, backpackers, young people, and it's increasingly famous due to well-known celebrities like Chris Hemsworth and Zac Efron that live in the area. Not to talk about some of the debatable Netflix shows like Byron Bays that have been filmed in the area. So my chapter, the research that I've been doing in the area spans a decade now. And the project that I describe in my chapter are all based on some underlying principles that reflect the aims of this edited collection. So in the introduction, Freya and Bobby are trying to disrupt normative assumptions that local communities are first and foremost tourism destinations. And they argue that we need to recenter the rights of residents of these host communities in order to ensure their long-term sustainability, equity, and justice. So this is closely linked to the importance of human rights and the rights of residents of these communities to access and enjoy the natural and built environments of their communities. My third point is that generally in tourism studies, there's been a real lack of interest and focus on intergenerational equity and this notion that children should be seen and not heard. So, you know, children have rights just like adults have, and they have a right to enjoy the places in their community, to have a say and to participate in how tourism develops in their community. So my work is based on a critical theory called childism that's been emerging in the social sciences. And it's employed to understand children's marginalized experiences, a little bit like feminism, post-colonialism, and anti-racism. Childism provides a theoretical lens that helps deconstruct adultism and reconstruct more age-inclusive research and advocacy. In my chapter, I also discuss this notion of relational activism that really describes the type of activism that unfolded during my research projects described in the chapter. So now on to the fun stuff. So as I mentioned, I've been researching tourism issues in the Byron Shire communities for about a decade now. It all started with my PhD. And the first project that I was involved in was a youth participatory filmmaking project. And as you can see from the images here, the children had a really strong connection and care for the environments in their community. And they chose the topics of their animations. They created little clay figurines and put together these animations that really focus on the impacts of tourism on the natural environment, and they really want tourists to take responsibility for their actions and trying to curb the negative impacts of tourist behavior, such as littering. So they really take on a role as educators and stewards in demanding tourists to change their behaviors. And these really funny little animations online, so you can search for them. And I wrote about them in chapter 5 in Freya's edited collection. The second project is called Youth for Sea, and it developed out of a project with a group of colleagues at Southern Cross University with a slightly older age group, so late teens and early 20s. And the young people in our project actually co-researched these tourism issues in the community, and they wanted to implement an intervention plan. So they used humor to start conversations with tourists. And as you can see in the far right-hand picture, they created these butt feeders where they were asking tourists to actually place their cigarette butts in the containers that they created. And they went around on the beaches collecting cigarette butts over a very busy period of the tourist season, which is Christmas. And they started up conversations with the tourists. So they really took on a role as activists and stewards on the front line, educating visiting tourists to respect the environment. The last project is called Our Home Holiday Town, and it developed over 2 years. We collaborated with a local not-for-profit youth social theatre group called Byron Youth Theatre. And it was a very participatory project where the young people, again, co-researched the social issues connected to over-tourism in their community. And they wanted to focus on things like lack of affordable housing, homelessness, and disrespect for Aboriginal sacred sites that often happen at, in the tourist season. Based on the findings of this research, they created a theatre performance that they then performed in the local community and in the local high schools. They also, the project had a really practical outcome. They not only performed the production, but they also wanted to create a responsible tourism pledge. So the pledge is actually a fantastic website, and I've popped the link in there. It's called Byron Way Pledge. And the young people consulted in the community and worked with stakeholders to create this website, and with those pledge items to ask tourists to respect nature, culture, and people. So it was a really great grassroots movement that emerged from the project and is still gaining momentum in the community. So I just wanted to be brief today, and I'll leave you with a quote from my book. And I think, there really needs to be a concerted effort to reorient tourism based on the rights of residents of host communities, including the rights of children, because they are important but often overlooked stakeholders in the tourism industry. I'm happy to take questions at the end. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Antonia. You said a few words that really make my heart sing with childism as the approach. The research is impeccable with co-research and also have activism within it. So we were very happy, Bobby and I, to have you in the book. So thank you so much for that great presentation. Dr. Phoebe, can we go to you next? We'd love to hear about you and your work, please.
Hello, thank you everyone, and thank you Freya for organising this, and thank you to the panel and everyone involved in organising. I'm very happy to be here. So I'll start as well by acknowledging the fact that I'm speaking to you on Awabakal and Worimi lands, and from Newcastle, Australia, also known as Mullumbimba, and to acknowledge that the lands have never been ceded, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Mullumbimba, the name Mullumbimba actually means sea fern, and our heart.
Sorry for the technical difficulties.
Okay, here we go. Fingers crossed. Okay, so Mullumbimba actually means sea fern, and on the harbour here where I am, there is no longer any sea fern here. So I think that really tells us something about where we're at in the state of the world, in Australia, on settler colonial lands especially, and the destruction that capitalist neoliberal colonial models have had on not only the landscape but people, and in those very holistic senses. And a lot of my work really looks at the problems of tourism development that is embedded within such capitalist growth models, and the fact that it's not necessarily good for anyone in the end, I think. And I think we can really see that with what's happening at the moment. We've seen it through COVID. We've seen how COVID has affected the tourism industry. We've seen the problems of tourism that is dependent on such systems, and what happens when such systems break down, such as it did in COVID. And I really feel like these systems are at the end of their life as well. We're seeing that with what's happening in Europe with the wildfires. We're seeing it all over the world, not only in terms of on people's livelihoods, and that's been happening for a long time, but now it's really affecting the tourists. And for the first time since COVID, really, I'm hearing all of this speak around tourism behaviour having to change, that the impacts that this is going to have on the industry. whether or not that's even just having tourism at different times of the year, that maybe the Mediterranean no longer has tourism anymore. So I really, so with this book chapter, I'm really sort of arguing that we shouldn't have such binary positions around what is global and what is local. It's multi-scalar, and there is no way to disconnect what's happening from the local from the global. So for me, I think that it makes sense to talk about all of this in a multi-scalar way. And when I talk about localizing tourism, of course, like everyone else in the book, it's about putting the needs of host communities first, not only the social aspects, but also the environmental aspects. And I take a more than tourism perspective as well, drawing on Freya's earlier work around tourism being more than an industry, and really looking at what else is tourism. Tourism is embedded within all these bigger systems, and we need to move away from these models that advocate for unfettered growth at the expense of everything else that's happening within the system. And if we take that more than tourism approach, then we can start to unpack what else is going on and try to think about tourism as a force for good. And I also talk about more than tourism, drawing on non-representational theories from geography and geographies of enchantment, because what I see is that that we should also be looking at tourism in the sense of our embodiment within not only tourism, but also local spaces, and looking at tourism from the perspective of emotions, the body, affect, how we can re-enchant our everyday spaces. So the book chapter for me was sort of turning this idea of who is a tourist and a resident on its head, because my wonderful co-author, Sinead Francis Cohen, and myself were doing a whole lot of explorations within our own local vicinity during COVID, and sort of taking this lens of what does it look like to be a resident going on these local tours, and what does it show us about place that maybe we hadn't thought about before, because we're so used to just being in our own local place without the spontaneity, joy and playfulness that we have when we go to other places as a tourist. So the chapter is really about what might it mean if we bring some of those emotions that we might have as a tourist going elsewhere into our own local place, and start to really rethink the everyday. So not just thinking tourism, but rethinking tourism from the everyday perspective, because I think that we need to. We can't keep having these far-flung holidays, for a week once a year, or we have to rethink the entire way that we're doing things in these times of crises and increasing global challenges. And so part of that is also focusing on our own local vicinities as spaces of joy and care. And then what does it mean to have a kind of custodianship or stewardship to our own local place, to re-enchant local place, so that we might not need to feel like we've got to travel around all the time to different places, but we can be happy within place as well. Which is not to say that I don't think that we should be traveling at all. And there's a whole element in the book as well about making sure that local communities elsewhere are benefiting from tourism. But what might it mean to actually bring that idea into our everyday life? And of course, that's not to say that there isn't contested notions of what local recreation and public space is. And that is something that we explore in the chapter as well, in terms of there is no homogenous community as such, local community. And so what does it mean for the stories that we tell about local place, or how we engage in local place? Who's benefiting, who's not benefiting? These are all questions that we need to start asking ourselves, and we need to start having these conversations as well in relation to how do we want to make our everyday spaces and public spaces available and good for as many people as possible, and make sure that all the diverse stakeholders are getting joy out of our local place. And I think that there is definitely a lot to be said about custodianship, and I think that's a theme that comes up throughout the book quite a lot. And really putting forward these notions of custodianship and what does that mean in terms of care and responsibility towards place, and not only for the local residents living in place, but also for the tourists coming into place as well. So localizing tourism for me is also about, and we talk about this when we do the Newcastle afoot trip in the chapter, where we go on a walking trip of our own city, and we start to see how this particular walking trip is actually drawing on local business and community, and really making sure that that money and that the gaze is funneled into the local business so that those local businesses can thrive. Localization to me is about encouraging local consumption as much as possible, localizing supply chains, facilitating encounters with local people, place, and non-humans in ways that that really put forward to make sure that everyone benefits. And I think that in terms of these times of crises and increasing crises that we're living in, there's multiple pathways forward. So I'm not saying that this is the only way to do things, but I do think that when we talk about tourism, we should be expanding our notion of what tourism is and what is possible and how we can do other ways of tourism. And I think that exploring our own local place and vicinity can be part of that. So that's really what the book chapter is about. And I will leave it there. And I see that Bobby has entered the waiting room, so she's right on time. That's great. I look forward to discussing these issues further with everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Phoebe, for your passionate talk and the idea of enjoying place and having fun. It gives us a really good spirit. I think maybe we need to give Bobby a chance to orient herself as she comes from Tulsa into our room to discuss with us. So perhaps with your indulgence, we can move to Professor Ken Singh in the lovely Tasmania to share with us his thoughts from his chapter, which were a wonderful contribution to theorization. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Freya, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone. Greetings from Tasmania. Tasmania is one of the most beautiful places in the world. I believe it may be in your bucket list. I do encourage you to visit. All right. Tasmania may be a very, very beautiful country, but I would also like to acknowledge that it has a very, very ugly and horrible past, a story of invasion, dispossession, and I would like to acknowledge the First Nation people. Here, I would like to pay respect to the elders who are past, present, and to those who did not get to elder status. This is a very difficult conversation to have in many ways, right? But it is one that is very important, right? And I would like to, with that note, I would like to go into my short presentation, and I would like to share my screen. I'm going to start off with this rather pompous and positive sounding title for my presentation. I thought that it will be Friday evening for many of you, and it's Saturday morning for us. So and what I'm going to talk about is about the local terms, right? And what I would like to just start off very quickly is to look at some common approaches when we talk about taking the local turns in tourism. Many of these concepts are already very familiar to all of you, and therefore I will not go into details. But within all these approaches, you realize that there is an element of localizing tourism. So for example, the first one is stakeholder theory and the triple bottom lines. Many tourism operators do employ the triple bottom lines. They get involved in corporate social responsibility, respecting the local community, if not supporting them. That includes supporting football clubs or taking care of the community or cleaning up the environment. Another approach that has a local dimension to it is the public-private partnerships. where businesses and the local authorities cooperate to work together to tap into the local expertise, as well as to tap into the management and business expertise of businesses. We often call it as PPP, public-private partnerships. And as we know in the literature, we are never really satisfied with those approaches when we take the local turn. And therefore, we have approached scholars and practitioners who argue for a re-regulating the regulation of the market. That is making sure that the tourism market works in a way that benefits the local environment as well as the local communities as well. For example, differential pricing going to tourist attractions, right, or taxing businesses more. Despite all these three approaches, I think as we are going to see, if you read the book, you'll see that there are responses against these approaches. And therefore, what has become very popular today is the community-focused, community-led, and community-first approaches. And I will actually see that the regenerative tourism movement, in some ways, is part of that approach. That is to put the community first, consulting them. I think we can all agree that these are all important approaches, and we can debate about the advantages and the disadvantages. But what I want to argue, as Fryer pointed out, is at least theoretically, when we look at all these local turn approaches, they are basically addressing two moral limits of the market. Okay. So what are the two moral limits of the market, of the tourism market? The first one is that we assume, all right, if we participate in tourism, we are engaged in a process where the whole society is being, so they are the community in the market, right? And many of the aspects of the local community are sacred, and should be and should not be for sale. So, for example, all right, places of worship, right? For example, in Mallorca, all right, where I visited a couple of times, there are some beautiful churches, and you have people who are in their beachwear going to a church, right? And that is simply unacceptable, right? And that is what we call repugnant transactions. But in the market, in the tourism market, we kind of assume that there is a price for everything. So the local community has to define what are repugnant transactions and what should not be allowed. Right? So for many people, their Christmas dinner is very sacred that they spend with their family. So for me, who is not a Christian, coming from not a not-Christian society, I want to participate in an authentic local Christmas dinner. Can I pay you to visit your family and join you for your Christmas dinner, right? So I think for many people, that would be quite repugnant. Just say this is something that is out of bound. Another moral limit of the market is that the market distributes welfare in a particular way. It distributes welfare and benefits to those who can afford to buy the products and the goods. So an example is medical tourism. Now, in some countries, we have medical tourism, right? Especially for plastic surgery. So I want to join a K-pop band. So I can go to Thailand or South Korea and get my face all fixed up. I don't think that will help. I think I need a head transplant. But nonetheless, what we have is that we have created an industry where there are many medical professionals that have gone into plastic surgery rather than providing medical services that is very much needed in the community, right? So we end up in a situation where the distribution of the benefit of the market goes to those who can actually afford it rather than those who actually need it. We can criticize the market at so many different ways, all right? But what we have is when we talk about taking the local turn, we will expect them to manage the market much better and that we can actually address the moral limits better. But if we take a step back, we may realize that the local approaches may aggravate these moral limits. Right? Why is that the case? Right? We may actually aggravate the moral limits because there are embedded injustices in the society, there are embedded inequity, and there are institutionalized nepotism and cronyism as well. So when we talk about doing the local turn, we should also ask ourselves, are we going to perpetuate certain injustices that already exist in society? Are we going to respect the type of social structures that would be considered rather problematic? Right? As you can see with my examples here, you can see that I'm a Republican. All right, I don't believe in the monarchy. All right, and I don't think anyone should be born into a job, for example. Right. So how should we actually then situate the local? We ask ourselves, which local are we talking about? A point that Phoebe actually already highlighted. We should actually understand that a society must be understood holistically. And so what it means is that all the different parts work together. While we appreciate a local society in its own terms, there are also, as in all societies, social ambiguities, social complexity. And all societies are diverse. It is stratified. Some people benefit more than others. And fortunately, all societies change. We need to change. We are now using Wi-Fi and the internet to in all our different places now, and there are outside influences. So we are wearing t-shirts and jeans. I'm thankful that I'm not wearing so-called Chinese traditional clothing, which is definitely not very comfortable. Right. So what are the implications for that? There are many local practices that are rather problematic. I don't want to acknowledge that. I'll just bring some personal examples here. I grew up with my grandmother. She was born in 1890, and she has her feet bound to the size of about 6 inches, because she's a woman, and they bound her feet. I don't think I would like those values to be continued, because during that time, she was not given the opportunity to go to school. She would not find jobs, and she has been discriminated. And very similarly, when I'm actually looking in Tasmania, doing my research in the local community and tourism, I see that everyone agrees that we should respect the community and local society and values. What is important to me is that how everyone claim that they are speaking for the community. But no one really actually can agree on what is that community, as everyone advocating, supporting the community, supporting small businesses and so on. But what I am seeing, which is quite troubling, is that 1/3 of the workforce working in the hospitality and tourism industry, they live below the poverty line. I think that is a community that we need to support and champion for, and we do not hear a lot of those voices. So what does that mean? If we want to take the local term, let us take it in a more enlightened way, and let us be forthcoming with our values, right? And just say that, how are we going to talk about, what are the values we are talking about? Are we unashamed to say that, well, I was born in Singapore, I've been brought up to think about wonderful Asian values, right? And I have problems with the so-called values, right? Because I have to be docile to the authorities, right? But I think we can respect that there are certain universal values, although they are being attacked now, about justice and equity. We can also talk about democracy, in which something that I believe in, and I'll defend it. To say that it is imperfect, it is rather inconvenient, but the rule of law, accountability, transparency, and the protection of diversity and minority rights are very important. So wherever we want to take the local turns, and go into the and take on to initiate tourism projects with the community in mind, I think we should also subject our ideas and our strategies to these principles and move it forward together. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ken Singh. And that was an amazing presentation where we went from K-pop to democracy. I'd love to see you in a K-pop band. I would pay tickets to watch that. Finally, everyone, we have co-editor of the book, Bobby Chu Bigby, with us, and she's also an author on 2 chapters as well as co-editor. Bobby is an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. She was awarded her PhD recently from Newling Research Institute at the University of Notre Dame. Congratulations, Bobby. She's going to have her graduation ceremony very soon. She's now a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Waterloo, working on Indigenous-led tourism and resurgence. Bobby, I'm so glad you're with us. Would you like to do your presentation? Welcome.
Yes, thank you. It's great to see everybody. And let me share my screen with my slides. We can all see these, I'm hoping. Great. Okay. Let me see here. Okay, so yes, greetings. I come to you actually from Muskogee Creek Nation Reservation here in Oklahoma, and it is Friday in the early evening here, and I'm just really thrilled to be joining all of you today. So it's just been an honor to have been able to have collaborated not just with Freya, but with all of the authors and co-authors in this volume. I think on you know, a topic that is just so relevant, was absolutely relevant before COVID, but COVID absolutely kind of you know, accelerated these conversations on, you know, what does the local even mean? And what does this look like in all of our different contexts and countries and communities that we're bringing to the conversation here? And I think that one of the key points that Freya and I had kind of talked about, you know, in our conversations, and then as we were trying to frame the book and bring these voices in, was really this key point that sometimes this, you know, and we were often challenged, you know, about, well, you know, the local, it can sound great and it can sound romantic, but, you know, oftentimes this local approach can be co-opted by more negative forces, which we acknowledge. And so I think that a key point that I always go back to when I look at you know, the different voices and the work that we've all brought into this, is this key point that's made in the introduction, that this localizing tourism is not intended to be a narrow-minded survivalist shutting off of communities as isolated microcosms, but instead it's rather communities that are in relation, in relatedness, showing a way forward where tourism is redesigned to build quality of life for communities, ecologies, and all the generations. And I feel that, you know, with many of our chapters, we tried to really make that clear, that when we're talking about local community, we are not just talking about the human, but also the non-human living relations and living ecologies upon which we all depend. So starting from the local, I'll kind of start a little bit backwards, but with the chapter that's most relevant to the lands upon, you know, that I am on here today. I really had the honor to be able to collaborate with Michelle Brown Burdix, who is also a native of Tulsa, Oklahoma, here in the US, and who has worked for the past 25 years as one of the lead cultural interpreters and tour guides at the Greenwood Cultural Center here in Tulsa. And together we worked together on this chapter 10 that was a practitioner case study, but really kind of did a critical dive into looking at tourism in sites of massacres And the impetus for this chapter was the fact that in 2021, as we were putting together the edited volume, this was the centennial commemoration of what was called the Tulsa Race Massacre, or the Greenwood Race Massacre that had happened in 1921 in the historically African-American neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma. So to just give a little bit of background, many of you might be familiar about, the very difficult kind of history of race relations that we have in the United States, in particular in the American South. Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma was no exception to this, even though Oklahoma was created actually first essentially as kind of a site of forced removals, a concentration camp for over 39 different federally recognized tribes moved and marched from all parts of the United States and even southern Canada. But later, as my father and I, we are members of the Cherokee Nation, after our tribal lands were forcibly allotted and we had non-Indigenous settlers, we also had a large influx of recently emancipated African-American slaves that had come into Oklahoma. I should also note that a difficult part of our own history as tribal nations is that some of our tribes, including my own, had been slave-holding tribes. And so there had been some tribal members who had a history of owning African-American slaves. But basically, by the early 1900s, Oklahoma becomes this very interesting place where you have the tribal nations, you have non-Indigenous white settlers, and you have African Americans that start to form a very cohesive, strong community. In particular, the African American community of Greenwood, which still stands in the north of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And Greenwood really stood out as an anomaly because it began to be really an economic success. By the early 1920s, it was called Black Wall Street. And that was because by this early part of the 1900s, in 35 square blocks, you had a community of nearly 10,000 people. There were 38 grocery stores, 30 restaurants, 12 churches, over 12 Black doctors and lawyers' offices, 1 hospital, 2 schools, 2 theaters, 4 hotels, and 2 newspapers that were owned and run by Black Tulsans for Black Tulsans. So a really, truly exceptional place that you didn't see in much of the rest of the United States, let alone much of the rest of the U.S. South. But unfortunately, at the very end of May of 1921, due to rumors that spread of an encounter between a Black male and a white female, there was basically a very large white mob that attacked and burned Greenwood to the ground. And so within the span of 24 hours, you had what was once called Black Wall Street burned to the ground, and it's estimated that nearly 300 Black Tulsans of Greenwood lost their lives, and many of the survivors became homeless. So this is another picture of Greenwood that was burned to the ground just overnight. And so in trying to remember this history, because like I said, even though Greenwood was burned to the ground and people had to be, became essentially internally displaced people, Greenwood did rebuild over the 20th century. And a testament to that resilience is the fact that in 1995, the Greenwood Cultural Center was opened in the Greenwood neighborhood. And since that time, and here is Michelle, who I work together, who was the co-author. She has been giving tours and, really being able to work with the survivors and the families of the survivors of the massacre to be able to tell this story of the massacre, but also of the resilience and of rebuilding. This picture here to the right is of the 3 survivors that have still been alive for the centennial commemoration in 2021, but are still alive today. And so in this chapter, we, really just talked about a lot of the difficulties and traumas that even go into, telling day in and day out this story of massacre, and some of the tensions that are involved with, what does the local community constitute in the case of Greenwood? Well, it's not that simple anymore because, yes, Greenwood is still made up of primarily, an African-American community, many of whom are descendants of that massacre. And yet the city of Tulsa started to kind of open itself up to this story and started to see the tourism potential in it. So how do you reconcile, this history of massacre, and tell this ethically through the platform of tourism, when you have a lot of different competing interests that are all saying, yes, they're part of the local story of what is Tulsa. So that was the chapter that Michelle and I had the privilege of working on together. The other chapter that I had worked on together with Freya, as well as an important Indigenous Australian mentor of mine, Uncle Joe Moendi Edgar, was focused on place-based and Indigenous-based ideas of governance and tourism. And so this chapter kind of takes us back to Australia, and specifically to the Kimberley region of the far northwestern area of Australia. In looking at these kind of Indigenous and place-based ideas of governance, bringing that to, to reckon with the idea of local community and, how governance can take place in tourism. And so we started out with this chapter with actually turning to a Maori example from Aotearoa, New Zealand, of the concept of turanga wewe, which really was a foundational concept of connection to place from an Indigenous perspective that really helped to inform our work. And so based on that, we just really engage with these ideas of the importance of reasserting local and Indigenous-led control and governance over places in this wider context of tourism and placelessness. But like I said, because Freya and I were able to collaborate closely with Uncle Joe Edgar, who is a proud Garadjari and Yaru traditional owner, we were able to focus in specifically on his decades of work in being a cultural leader and also a tourism leader in Garadjari country, which is the southern coastal and desert area of the Kimberley region. And this close collaboration actually came out of my PhD dissertation work, where I looked specifically at the Garadjari approach to tourism development. And so overall, Garadjari traditional owners in the last 15 years have taken a centralized and collective and really an organization-driven approach to tourism. In 2016, the traditional owner group, the PBC, they adopted what's called an IPA visitor permit, so an Indigenous Protected Area visitor permit that requires any non-Garadjari people who access that part of country to have to pay for the time that you are on Garadjari lands and waters. But then the real big move came in 2017 when the ILSC, or the Indigenous Land and Sea Council, on behalf of Garadjari traditional owners, acquired what was formerly also a tourist site, but the bird park, Portsmouth Bird Park. And basically it was from that bird park that Garadjari traditional owners have been in the works in creating a Garadjari tourism hub and cultural base. That's not just for these on-country tourism programs, but is also serving as a base for rangers, and also a base for camping, for research, and for different event facilities and cultural learning for Garadjari and non-Garadjari alike. one of my very first tours to Garajari country, I went with Winston Shoveler, who's shown here, who is an emerging Garajari leader. And one of the examples of this idea of connecting to place and community is really the start of the tour, where Winston takes the visitors to the lagoon and instructs everyone that, okay, you know, you've met my family and you've met the community, but here on Garajari country, you also need to introduce yourself to the land. And so he leads the visitors in this Garajari ritual that's called Higgins-Desbiolles, where you take this handful of water and you swish it in your mouth, and then you spray it out towards the sun. And in that act, you're introducing yourself to the country. The country's able to understand a little bit more of your smell and who you are. What is your intention in coming to that country? And so I think it really doesn't get more local than this, and talking about introducing yourself and getting acquainted to not only the local community of Garajari people, but to the living country, lands and waters itself. But really I think this chapter kind of hinges on the perspectives of Uncle Joe Edgar. And he talks about, you know, the importance and the enthusiasm that so many Garajari people have for bringing tourism responsible and Garajari-led tourism onto country, but that there is a tension between the governance that happens through the PBC, the prescribed body corporate, that is the Aboriginal organization through which a lot of this tourism development has happened. There's tension between the governance steps that happen through the PBC versus traditional perspectives on governance. And this is really where we get to, what does place-based governance mean from a traditional Garajari perspective? And so Uncle Joe talks about how traditionally Garajari people have had 3 language dialect groups, but also 3 distinct cultural groups that look out for different geographical parts of country. Naja Naja is coastal, Nauru is the northeastern hinterland, and Nangu is the southeastern desert. And so he talks about how traditionally it would be those families from those particular cultural and language groups who would be able to have the final say over those parts of country. You wouldn't have coastal families speaking for desert and vice versa. However, with today's PBC organization, where you take a very Western democratic approach of, you know, majority rules, and you suddenly have coastal families speaking for desert and vice versa. And so there's a tension there. So this is what Uncle Joe brings through his perspectives, that we currently have a sort of democracy where majority rules. If you're polling on a particular issue, whoever raises the most hands passes the policy. But when it comes to land management and issues that directly impact our country, those protocols should not exist. In our Garajari culture, the custodians are the traditional owners, but they are also the custodians of this particular part of country. Those people from those particular areas, they look after the country and have particular say over what should happen. So I think a really very interesting kind of reality check on these kind of Western democratic norms that are very, very important across all, you know, all of our nation states, all of our countries, but really kind of putting this into dialogue with other perspectives on place-based governance and Indigenous understandings of governance. And so we round out that chapter by really talking about all these different values and considerations that Freya, Uncle Joe, and myself really advocate should be you know, kind of understood and embraced when we talk about place-based approaches to governance and tourism, including these ideas of being inclusive of all diversities, the commitment to place, this idea of regeneration, of moving beyond just sustainability, being strengths-based rather than deficit-based, being citizen-led, a focus on causing little to no harm, and ultimately the importance of turning to the voices of our elders and the histories and lessons from the land and the water upon which we all depend. So I will wrap up there, but very glad to be joining all of you today. Thank you. Wadon.
Thank you so much, Bobby, and I'm so glad that you could join us. Now, everyone, this is a chance for you to formulate your questions, your burning ideas, and to come back and talk to us after we have a 5-minute break with Professor Jim leading the discussion. I'll propose to introduce Professor Jim and then hand over to him. So, Kazem, 5 minutes, is that right? I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Freya. Yeah, we have a short video while everybody can grab his or her cup of coffee and come back. We'll be back soon. Admin.
In Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have a way we like to do things.
Whether you're local or you're here on holiday.
Hi! We all have a shared responsibility to look after this awesome place.
From the mountains to the sea. And all places in between.
We would care for our taonga, no matter its size.
We call it the Kiwi Way.
It means being responsible for all our rubbish and not leaving it on the land.
It means using a toilet, not the bushes.
Or holding on until your next available dunny.
Respecting the wildlife. Giving them space and peace to breed.
And to feed, naturally.
It means enjoying the country safely.
And telling someone where you're going.
It's knowing which track suits best.
And when it's good to turn back.
It means keeping our distance when we take photos.
Yeah, so that's it. It's a way that we can all enjoy this beautiful land and make sure our kids can too.
Thank you very much. We have a few more minutes of the break. And meanwhile, before our speakers come back and you get ready, we will introduce some of the SCoT past webinars, and recordings of even this webinar will be available shortly in SCoT YouTube channel. Due to the time difference, we do not expect everybody to wake up in the midnight or very early morning or late evening to be on Zoom or YouTube right now, but we have a number of people watching us on YouTube. Maybe it's more convenient for them at this time of the day. And we would like to invite all of you to watch the recording afterward. Freya, we have a short video. Maybe if you have 1 or 2 minutes, it shows people how they can watch the recording later. Is it okay if we go with it? So it's just
Definitely.
1 minute.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, admin. For those who are watching us on YouTube, please use the comment or chat box to send your questions. My colleagues will bring your questions live on Zoom, and we will try to answer you. Dr. Freya, back to you. please.
Thank you so much, Kazem. Next, we're going to move to the question and answer session, and I'm going to turn to my lovely mentor, Professor Jim Macbeth, who was the foundation staff member for Murdoch University in Western Australia. Before his retirement, he served as the Dean of the School of Social Sciences and Humanities. When he decided to retire and go to the world sailing, I envy him quite a lot, but he is still working. He serves on the International Advisory Board to TriNet, where you might know him, and does projects. So we cannot let him completely retire and go off sailing. Dear Jim, thank you so much for being with us, and I'd love for you to handle the Q&A sessions.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction, Freya. And I'm still waiting to figure out how I get the questions. I haven't seen them yet on the screen, so I'll say a little bit more about the way I approached this today. This was something Freya asked me to do some time ago, and I just said yes without realizing that it was actually going to be quite new for me, because I've not done a lot of Zoom and certainly not webinars. But I also really wanted to look at the book, because I've always had an interest in the local, and particularly power and community issues. And coincidentally, I should say, one of the things I found most striking in the book was what's called, I guess it's a foreword called Local Roots. It's very creative and heartfelt introduction to the thinking for this kind of work. That was a really nice little introduction. And I think the overall book is very important because of quite a lot of variety too. And I must say that I've learned quite a bit just listening to the speakers because of the different emphases. Coincidentally, I'm working with a concept out of sociology of social capital to formulate some documents to go into an arbitration for my sailing club. Instead of sailing, I'm actually helping where we're having a dispute with the government and going to arbitration. And social capital is a very important issue in the local as well. And I was particularly noticing and thought about three of the presenters. I hadn't thought about convenes yet, because Antonio's, Phoebe's, and Bobby's case studies all rely on very strong social capital for the movement of the way in which those communities take control, and the way we think about how communities can take control. And I should add that I live in a tourism hotspot in Fremantle, Western Australia, on the Indian Ocean. We, at least this book represents the entire coastline. We even dropped down to Tasmania, which is really important the way we think about the local as well. And from the book and from the presentations, one of the things that I thought about and have been very interested in for a long time are issues of power. And issues of power inform and actually deform many of the issues that we might talk about in terms of the local. If we don't consider where power sits within communities, we can actually miss out on many of the opportunities. And I think a couple of the speakers have highlighted the way in which communities have taken charge, and that's basically about power. What we don't know in a more macro look at issues of power is how the community is made up, and some of the chapters obviously have talked about that, but also there can be an underlying concept that somehow communities, whatever they are homogeneous, and of course they are not. And we've seen that in some of the displays as well, with things like diversity being highlighted. These words are all very complex, and they're what I would call wicked problems. They are very, very complicated. And it's too easy, and I find it actually very challenging to recognize that we are dealing with very complex, humans have complex societies. So it's quite important that we think about the way that what these concepts mean. And one of the things I decided to look up dictionary definitions, and I looked at some of the materials I wrote years ago about community. And even if we think about our disciplines, I don't know what disciplines each of you have come out of specifically, but anthropology, sociology, archaeology, politics, and history all have different senses of what community means and how they use it, if they actually define it. So we always, when we're talking local, we often conflate the concept of local with the concept of community, which is not simple. So there's a whole range of issues that we consider, and this book has highlighted for me, and that's one of the things to remember about, I guess, all of our reading, and all of you know this, is that what author A can write, maybe not, it leads us to go off in different directions in the way we think about the world. And that's a really important part of our scholarship, is how it develops us, as well as how we then use it. In this context, we're talking about the local, of course.
Jim, can I interrupt you? Because we have a question coming in.
I haven't figured out how to get the chat questions.
I have one for you, so I'll read it, and if you'd like to assign it, that would be great. It's coming from Agung at Flinders University, who asks, in the aftermath of the pandemic, popular tourist destinations have experienced a substantial increase in visitors. While local communities view this as a long-awaited opportunity for enhanced income, there's a growing concern. Specifically in cost-effective destinations like Bali, certain tourists, influenced in part by social media, have displayed inappropriate behavior. This has intensified horizontal conflicts among stakeholders. What strategies can be implemented to mitigate these emerging tensions in the future? So would you like to hand that great question to one of the panel?
They could all have something to say about that question. But I think I'd suggest that Bobby has a start on it.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, I just in these last couple of days have come from the Critical Tourism Studies Conference that's been in North America in Montreal. And, we really started and ended on these questions of, what little has actually changed since the pandemic, even though so many of us were very hopeful that that would be a moment for real reflection on the part of travelers and visitors. And there was really great debate towards the very end of, can enlightened mass tourism exist, with people kind of having views all across the spectrum on this. Goodness, I think that this can be approached many different ways, but I think that for me, a lot of my interest is really in trying to reach visitors themselves and having them kind of critically reflect on, what are your intentions when you leave your home and you go to visit another place. Of course, vacations can be for leisure and relaxing and all of that sort of thing. And I think that that's what oftentimes then leads people to a sense that they have a right to go to wherever they want to for as long as they want to, and disregard kind of, local communities that live in places. But I think, really trying to appeal, because a lot of people would say, we really have to change the industry. We really have to get to degrowth and not encourage this. But I guess my personal perspective is really kind of appealing to the visitors themselves and just, asking if it's too much of an ask to, really critically reflect on what are the intentions behind, your movements and your travels. And, by perhaps just, being a little bit more broad-minded in your intentions behind why you're going to a place, and, including some education and including, a meaningful cultural experience that isn't just run by kind of, you know, a big tourism industry, but more of a local family or a local community. So I guess my perspective on it would be trying to really get visitors to try to be open to shifting their thinking a little bit. But I think you can look at this from all different sides. So
thank you, Bobby. Anybody else like to comment on that question?
Yes, I would. Thank you, if that's okay.
Yes.
I think it is a great question, and I think it goes back to what Jim's talked about with these wicked problems. And as Bobby points out too, there's many angles that you could take with this question. There's no simple answers. I think on the one hand, you know, focusing on the individual behaviour is one way, and I think Bali is already implementing strategies such as trying to educate tourists, getting them to sign pledges, banning people from riding on motorbikes, etc. So I think there's already a movement happening in Bali around that from the locals themselves. But I also think it goes back to these bigger questions and thinking about tourism as more than just tourism. It's a systemic problem that is not just about tourism. And as Bobby says, it's this mentality that around leisure and recreation and tourism that now is our time for relaxation, so we can therefore go and do whatever we want. And I think we need to rethink everything about our lives in relation to these problems, because what kind of lives are we living? And I know Freya's done some great work around this, where we're working so hard and miserable, and that there's, you know, a sense of loss of meaning, and it goes back to a lot of holistic issues around loss of self, loss of spirituality, loss of connection, industrialized capitalism, individualism, where there's this idea that tourism is a kind of liminal space outside of that kind of creates this sort of atmosphere where people can do what they want. And I think we need to actually rethink everything, not just the actual tourism component, but the entire system.
I think the example of Indonesia is a very important one here, because you know, we're not far from Indonesia here in Western Australia, and since the pandemic, the behaviour has certainly not got any better of tourists, but I've detected a change in the way in which Bali is thinking about its relationship to tourists. And how that plays out in the longer term, I don't know, but I'm sure other communities are going to do the same thing. And one of the concerns about when we talk about the locals and local people taking some control is a place like Port Fairy on the south coast of Australia, where the holiday letting through companies like Airbnb has so taken over that town that the locals have to move out. And we have problems throughout Western Australia for tourism towns trying to find places for staff to live. So there's another dynamic going on in relation to that. Freya, do you want to push us another question?
I think Antonia wants to respond as well, Jim.
Oh, did I miss a hand? That's what that blur was across the screen. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to add to what Bobby and Phoebe were saying from the local perspective here in Byron Bay. I think the pandemic was a moment where residents actually stopped and realised that how enjoyable it is to access the places in their community without the crowds of tourists. So in that last project that I spoke about, our home holiday town, the community and the young people here felt empowered after the pandemic to actually say, look, we want to change the way tourism is done here in the community. And so they came up with this pledge idea, which, you know, puts the responsibility back on the tourists. But I think the pandemic was a good time to actually reclaim some of those spaces and places in the community and try to regulate tourism in a way that's you know, harmonious and with the values of the communities. Yeah,
thank you.
And Singh, do you want to respond as well?
Well, Thank you very much, Freya and Jim. I think I think there are several ways to control tourist behaviors, and I think the most direct way is to throw the book at them, and and that's what happened in Singapore in the 60s and 70s. If you misbehave, you'll be fined and you'll be deported. And I think following from what Phoebe, Antonio, and Bobby have been saying is, if we want to rethink about the host tourist relationship, I think this is the opportunity, because we are still talking about society in tourism. That is, we see how society is being commodified and packaged and enjoyed by tourists. I think we should flip it around now and talk about tourism in society, and that all policies and incentives should be framed in a different way. We are still giving incentives to tourism businesses and operators to develop tourism. And as a result, they will have more, using Jim's idea is the idea of power. That is, you give power, you give resources to the tourism industry to develop the destination. I think it's more important to give the money to community groups where they can decide on the tourism development, and tourism operators approach them and suggest ideas on developing the destination, so they actually have more say and flip the power around. And then they wouldn't have those lobbies that says that tourists can behave badly because they provide a lot of jobs.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Freya?
Jim, I'm not seeing any questions coming through in the chat. I hope I haven't missed anybody. I think that our presenters have been wonderful and comprehensive.
If I may interrupt, Freya, I received the question directly to me, so I would like to.
Thank you.
It's about the era of global economy and being engaged in global tourism market, how localism should be defined or redefined. How or what does the dynamic conservation of local resources means? If I may translate or interpret this question, I think that's a interesting question. Is asking that in what extent a local should stay local, or what are the borders of interaction in global tourism market, or in another way, in what extent we are going to conserve the authentic local and still exist and compete in the global tourism market. I will prefer to rely on you, Freya, to assign people to answer this question.
I think, well, I won't answer the question. I've already actually said a few things that are implied within the question, but I wonder which one of the panels would be. I think everybody on the panel has something to say about those issues. So if we can, who's going to put their hand up first? Nobody. Yes, here we have. Go.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, and I think, you know, it's irony, it's ironic, because what ends up happening is that it ruins these places, and then tourists have to go to other places to consume the authenticity of the experience or whatever. So I think there needs to be more discussion. I think a lot of tourism operators probably already perhaps know this to some degree as well. So I think it's really, I mean, the fact is that these catch-up models and the way that tourism is done in these ways, it ruins the places anyway, which ruins the local employment, which ruins the industry. So it's, yeah, I just wanted to point out the irony of that, I suppose.
Well, maybe I'll attempt to make a comment. If we see that society is constantly changing and progressing, or moving backward. The whole issue about outside influences and globalization is an interesting one. I guess we just have to accept that society is constantly evolving, emerging, and it is up to the community, and despite its diversity, have a set of mechanisms to move society forward in a desired direction. I don't think it is people from the outside that can actually tell you what the society ought to be, but there is a need for a set of processes as like in a democracy to actually change society in a desired way. So there are things that have been touristified and become localized. We acknowledge that. And there are things that should be avoided. And I think the different stakeholders in the community has to decide on that.
The other thing that comes to mind for me is I was recently at a conference in WA, a tourism conference, and the head of Tourism WA, which is the government's arm for promoting tourism, and was a really good illustration of the problem of power and of how you influence that kind of power. The keynote speech given by this CEO never mentioned community or local in any way other than top down. So it's entirely, the whole speech is about give us more development, develop here, develop there, the whole range, which of course, even in the context of the wider problems of development in the world, within local communities, maybe we don't want that development. Maybe that's not the way it should be done. And it certainly is usually not the bottom-up kind of process that this entire conversation is about. So there are really key issues in WA, Western Australia, about that kind of development focus, which is resisted in many cases, and we've actually been able to successfully resist certain kinds of development. It also happens at local council levels where the elected representatives are more interested in more and more and more and more and more. Not always the best way to do it. Any other comments from the panel? Kazim, do you want to give us a new question?
Yes, if I may, before I pass it on to Jafar and Malcolm, I have one more question to raise about the distinctiveness and localism. In the past, we had less means of communication like social media or electronic way of communications and so on. But these days we have very easy ways of communication. So how distinctive should a local destination be to be sustainable? Or in another word, how the locality should provide a different experience that can be the identity of the destination. Does it mean that a community should not go through any let's say development process, or is it possible to combine development with distinctiveness in local level? Sorry, it might be confusing, but I want to see.
I think we have a pretty good gist of how to approach that. And I might ask Antonia to play with this question a little bit first, because Byron Bay has, and as would Phoebe's Newcastle, but Byron Bay in particular has a long history of tourism, probably 12 months a year. But it certainly has long grappled with issues around tourism and tourism development. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, thanks, Jim. I think Byron Bay is unique because it has a long history of tourism, as you said, but also a long history of participatory community involvement. So there are a lot of very vocal community groups here in Byron Bay that have tried to limit the tourism development and try to keep tourism as sustainable as possible. For example, in the 80s, there was a plan to build a huge Club Med resort type facility in Byron Bay, and community groups managed to stop that development. So I think it's unique in that sense. But I grew up in Italy, in another very famous tourist destination, which is Positano on the Amalfi Coast. And I think compared to places like that, the communities aren't as vocal in other destinations. So I'm not sure if it's a unique case, but we've managed to, in Byron Bay, limit tourism development so that it's sustainable and is coherent with the values of the community in a way. What is a little bit harder is to curb tourist behavior. So we get a lot of schoolies, like school leavers, that come up and trash the place and drink, and so that kind of behavior is harder to manage and curb, I think. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
yeah, thank you. Anybody else? Okay, it's a very, very complex issue, and I've had very minor research with Byron Bay back in the 80s, when it was clear that the locals or the local community had quite a strong sense of itself, and that's continued from a distance. It appears to have continued for a long time. Phoebe, do you want to talk about this as well in relation to Newcastle and how that works?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think that, why do tourists go to certain places? It's because of the unique character of the place. And again, it goes back to this irony of if things are catered too much for the tourists and not enough on the existing local community and culture and heritage, then it ends up ruining the place. And, it depends on what do tourists want? Do they want a Club Med kind of holiday where everything's the same? They know what to expect. They're just going to go to a resort and have some gated off experience where they can just hang around a pool? Or do they want to have an experience where they're actually immersed in a local culture and actually learning about things, like what Bobby said, with the amazing potentials for such tours to bring our attention to the layers of place and history and heritage and learn about the layers of inequalities. And so I think that that often there's this idea that tourism is just this thing that can be plonked onto a particular place, but then that, but I think there is also a lot of tourists that they don't want that experience anyway. So I think we need to sort of unravel that. And what do we mean by development? What do we mean by tourism? There's a lot of layers to address there, but I think the people making some of those decisions are, as Jim pointed out, it's got to do with power, it's got to do with top-down approaches, it's got to do with certain vested interests that are getting money out of certain types of development. And so there isn't actually the proper kind of rational processes that are actually being gone through to actually have a proper consultation with community around what actually needs to happen here. And for that to happen, it's a very in-depth invested process that needs to happen to capture people's voices that live in the place around what kind of development they want.
Can I add to that discussion? I do not intend to be contrarian, but I think there is also a need to acknowledge the facts that there are certain destinations that seems to be quite global and vanilla and attract a lot of visitors, even like Club Med or resorts or even cruise ships. Despite our criticisms of them, they have many customers. And the question is why? And I think more and more destinations are becoming alike rather than different, because tourists also like to have their home comfort, things they are comfortable with. They worry about the amenities, their security. And interestingly, New York, London, Shanghai, Singapore, I mean, all these places are big cities and they attract more tourists than anyone else, right? So we just have to be, the distinctiveness argument is part of the marketing campaign in which and it's important for a local community, but it's also that there are many things that are available globally that tourists want, but also locals also want them because it improves the quality of their life. So I'm not contradicting the argument, but I think we just have to balance it, to actually acknowledge that again, it's another wicked problem, right? And it will have to be the local community that decides how distinctive and what type of distinctiveness they want.
Very good points there, and I think it's worth. I guess it's worth remembering a couple of comments early in this book, in the introduction, about what's happening with Venice and Barcelona, and the way in which those cities are having to deal with, and it's common in the Med, I'm sure, from what I know. Venice and Barcelona have, I guess, I don't know where the welling up of concern came from, whether it was really local in the way we've been talking, or whether it's more to do with the wider local areas, but coping with over-tourism. And that is a problem in many places. The bigger cities, like you've mentioned, New York and Singapore and so forth, can cope with it in a way because they're already coping with too many people anyway. A few more tourists don't really matter. In the way in which we're thinking about the experience of people who live in places, and that's underlying for me a lot of the work that you're doing, all of you and all of the authors in the book, is about really the background of that is about what's it like to live somewhere and how do we become part of that living experience as tourists or as residents. Any more questions? Kazim?
I think we're nearing the end of our time, so maybe we should hand back to Kazim.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm still enjoying this conversation and learning, taking notes, and I have questions, but I do not have time, as I see here. I would like to pass it on to Malcolm first, and then as every time, I like Jafar to wrap it up after Malcolm. Malcolm, microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you very much, Freya and Jim and the team. Fantastic discussion. But I've been a city planner in Adelaide for some decades. And what you've talked about here is the ongoing conundrum. Who is to exercise governance? Yes, tourism needs to define which local. It needs to look at the rule of law. It needs to bring people together. But I would say, be careful what you ask for. The rule of law specifically, whose law? We see that reflected in local planning very much. I'd like to say that all is not lost, that the strength of the discussion we had this morning shows that, but you need to be precise about who's involved and why. Phoebe made a very interesting point in the last week, and that is that the whole thing is very slippery. It depends on who's involved, when, and what it involves that. So I just like to say, as rapporteur for this situation, and most of the discussions about that outside this meeting, but I think you've got your hands on the core, but we still have no solution really make it work. Except in specific situations, able to stay. That's all I need to say. Jafar will wrap it up. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Malcolm. Yes, being in a place for a long time, I think Malcolm can say, or maybe later on in other occasions, that what does the dynamic conservation of culture and local resources and locality means, and I would like to hear more from you in proper time. So I would like to ask Jafar, as usual, to wrap up the session. Jafar, mic is yours.
Well, thank you. And as usual, you give me the hard job at the end. For those of us who have social science background, this was all music into our ears. Every point of it, every point that was made by the panel makes a lot of sense. It became very clear that there are lots of good intentions, and it was also clear that we have to turn the good intentions to practice. And we got some good example of how we can practice what we preach. We were told more than once that we need to have holistic view of tourism studies or the community. And this particularly means hearing the local voices. And as we hear, local voices would be all segments of the population, from elderly people to the children. Even children were brought into the picture, that their voices needs to be heard, because after all, they are the next generation of the tourists. So if we learn them at the beginning when they are children, then we grow up with them, or research would grow up with them and respond to their needs. Which reminds me of one of the affiliate members of the United Nations World Tourism Organization, which has specialized in children tourism, and does work on, I believe, children-friendly hotels and children-friendly airlines and the sort. So as you can see, people are paying attention to different segments of the community. So the holistic view includes hearing all these voices and responding to them. We learned a lot about localizing tourism, but not museumizing tourism. And that was, in a way, part of the answer for the globalization versus localization that we talked about. At the end, it seemed to me we are all the ideas we have, if they are put together well, at the end, the real winner is going to be the local community, because we can improve the well-being of the local community. When the local community is happy with tourism, hosting tourism and happy with tourism, therefore the tourists in turn are going to be happy as well. It's going to be a sort of win-win situation if we put the well-being of the community into the center of our tourism studies. And there's a lot of work being done in this particular area. Health of the community, well-being of the community. As to the carrying capacity, which was mentioned, as to the over-tourism and the problem of that, there are many answers that are coming out. But we have to go to the old books. We had something called environmental carrying capacity. Later on, we changed it to cultural carrying capacity. So if we are localizing tourism, we have to see to what extent they can tolerate tourism. And that level of tolerance would tell us how much tourism should be built, whether it should be built under capacity, over capacity. When it's done over capacity, that results into over tourism and the problems that were mentioned. So the answer is go to the community to see how much of tourism they wish to have, and then do not go beyond that level of tolerance. I truly enjoyed this panel. Thank you very much, Freya, to you and your panelists. Many issues that are being forgotten are brought back into our mind, and hopefully into research. And the result of that hopefully would benefit the tourism industry and improve the well-being of the host community. Thank you very much, all, and back to you, Carson.
Thank you very much, Jafar. As expected, you wrapped it up. So we have no a specific or a general answer to the question. Each locality has its own way. And yes, we have to live with them and see what they want and what kind of tourism they can tolerate. I personally would like to take this. I have been doing this in local Japan for working with the Japanese rural destinations. And before coming to Japan, I thought that it's a very small country and everywhere is the same. But even two small villages are different, and two small communities, their desire are different. So that's a very much true. I learned again. I want to emphasize that this beautiful panel is not closed. It will be opened in our video library. I'm sure many scholars and students and so on will watch the video again. And I would like to ask Dr. Freya and our speakers to be kind enough for answering the questions that might come afterward. Thank you again, all of you, and we would like to see you in SCoT again. Once again, thanks for your long, valuable time and participation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.